Welcome to this deep dive into one of the darkest and most unsettling tales in American history. Well, here it is. In the humid spring of 1901, the small town of Crossville, Tennessee, awakened to news that would mark the beginning of a tragedy spanning 3 generations. The Dilling family, once respected in Cumberland County, was about to experience the first crack in their foundation, a fracture that would spread like poison through their bloodline. The town, with its dirt roads and wooden buildings, its coal mines and tobacco fields, watched as Thomas Dilling, a 28-year-old railroad worker, married Margaret Hayes, a 19-year-old woman whose beauty was only surpassed by the darkness that inhabited her mind. Nobody knew it then, but that union, celebrated in the small Baptist church on Main Street, would be the spark that ignited decades of suffering, madness, and despair. Thomas Dilling came from a line of hardworking men who had built their lives with their hands and sweat. His father, Jacob Dilling, had worked in the coal mines until black lung disease consumed his lungs, leaving him a shadow of the robust man he once was. Thomas had witnessed his father's slow death, the gradual loss of breath, the nights filled with violent coughing, the blood on handkerchiefs hidden from the family. That experience had taught Thomas the value of hard work but also the fragility of life. He had chosen to work for the railroad instead of descending into the mines, believing he could escape his father's fate. He was a tall man, with broad shoulders and calloused hands, his face marked by long hours under the sun. His brown eyes carried a mixture of determination and exhaustion, and his thick dark hair was always damp with sweat from his labor. Margaret Hayes came from a very different background. Her family lived on the outskirts of Crossville, in a dilapidated house surrounded by dead trees and untended land. Her father, William Hayes, was known in town as a violent drunk who spent more time in the local tavern than at home. Her mother, Sarah Hayes, had died when Margaret was only 12 years old, leaving her alone with a brutal father and 2 younger siblings she could barely protect. The townspeople whispered about the Hayes family, about the screams heard from their house at night, about the bruises Margaret and her siblings bore. But in that era, in that place, family problems stayed behind closed doors, and no one intervened. Margaret had grown into a beautiful young woman despite the circumstances. Her pale skin seemed to glow in the dim light of Tennessee, her long black hair fell in waves down her back, and her green eyes held a depth that fascinated and frightened those who looked into them. But beneath that beauty, something was broken. Margaret had witnessed and endured things no child should experience. Her father's abuse had left scars not just on her body but deep in her mind. She had developed a habit of staring into space for hours, lost in thoughts no one could reach. She spoke little, and when she did, her words were often disconnected from reality. She saw shadows where there were none, heard voices when the house was silent, and sometimes screamed in the middle of the night, waking the neighbors with her terror. Thomas had met Margaret at the general store where she occasionally worked, sorting merchandise for pennies. He had been immediately captivated by her beauty but failed to see the warning signs of her mental instability. Or perhaps he saw them and chose to ignore them, believing that love and a stable home could cure whatever afflicted her. He courted her for 6 months, bringing her wildflowers he picked along the railroad tracks, small gifts he could barely afford on his meager salary. Margaret responded to his attention with a mixture of gratitude and confusion, as if she couldn't quite believe someone could show her kindness without expecting violence in return. Their wedding was simple, attended by Thomas's family and a few curious townspeople. Margaret's father didn't attend, too drunk to even acknowledge the occasion. The ceremony was brief, conducted by Pastor Elijah Crawford, an elderly man who had seen too many troubled unions to believe that every marriage was blessed by God. As he pronounced them husband and wife, he noticed the vacant look in Margaret's eyes, the way she seemed to be somewhere else entirely, and he felt a chill run down his spine. But he said nothing. It wasn't his place to interfere. The couple moved into a small rented house on the eastern side of Crossville, a modest wooden structure with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a living area. The house was old, with floorboards that creaked with every step and walls that did little to keep out the cold in winter or the heat in summer. But it was theirs, and Thomas worked tirelessly to make it a home. He repaired the roof, fixed the broken windows, and even managed to buy a second-hand stove for Margaret to cook on. He believed that with hard work and dedication he could build a good life for them, a life free from the poverty and violence that had marked both their childhoods. The first months of their marriage were deceptively calm. Margaret seemed to stabilize in the security of her new home. She kept the house clean, cooked simple meals, and waited for Thomas to return from his long days at the railroad. But Thomas began to notice disturbing patterns. Margaret would sometimes stand at the window for hours, staring at nothing, her lips moving in silent conversation with invisible presences. She refused to sleep in complete darkness, insisting on keeping a lamp burning all night, claiming that shadows moved in the corners when the light went out. She jumped at sudden noises, screamed when Thomas touched her unexpectedly, and often woke him in the middle of the night with her crying, unable to explain what had upset her. Thomas tried to be patient. He told himself that Margaret had endured a difficult childhood and needed time to adjust to a normal life. He worked longer hours to provide more for her, hoping that material comfort would ease her distress. But the extra hours away from home only seemed to worsen her condition. Left alone for extended periods, Margaret's grip on reality became increasingly tenuous. She began talking to herself constantly, having full conversations with people who weren't there. She claimed that her dead mother visited her, standing in the doorway with accusations and warnings. She said that dark figures watched her from outside the windows, waiting for their chance to enter. The townspeople began to notice. Neighbors reported seeing Margaret wandering through her backyard at odd hours, sometimes in her nightgown, speaking urgently to the empty air. The wife of the local shopkeeper mentioned that Margaret had come in one day and tried to pay for groceries with leaves, genuinely confused when told they weren't acceptable currency. The postman reported that Margaret had answered the door completely naked, seemingly unaware of her state, and had handed him a letter addressed to someone who had been dead for 10 years. These stories spread through Crossville like wildfire, and the Dilling name, once respectable, began to carry a stigma of madness and shame. Thomas faced increasing pressure at work. His colleagues made jokes about his crazy wife, and his supervisor began to question whether his domestic situation was affecting his performance. In that era, a man was judged by his ability to control his household, and Thomas was clearly failing. He felt the weight of shame and responsibility crushing him, but he didn't know what to do. Medical care for mental illness was virtually non-existent in rural Tennessee. The closest thing to treatment was the state asylum in Nashville, a place known for its horrific conditions, where patients were often chained, beaten, and left to deteriorate in their own filth. Thomas couldn't imagine sending Margaret there. It would be like sending her to hell. In the fall of 1901, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. The news brought a brief moment of hope to Thomas. Perhaps, he thought, the responsibility of motherhood would ground her in reality, give her something real and tangible to focus on. But pregnancy only intensified Margaret's symptoms. Her mood swings became more violent and unpredictable. One moment she would be crying uncontrollably, convinced that the baby growing inside her was evil, a demon sent to destroy her. The next moment she would be euphoric, talking to her unborn child as if it could hear and understand her, making promises she couldn't possibly keep. She refused to eat for days, claiming the food was poisoned, then would gorge herself until she vomited. The physical changes of pregnancy were harsh on Margaret's frail body. She had always been thin, barely eating enough to sustain herself, and now her body was being drained by the developing fetus. Her pale skin became almost translucent, dark circles formed under her eyes, and her beautiful black hair began to fall out in clumps. She developed an infection that caused constant pain and fever, but she refused to see the town's doctor, screaming that he was part of a conspiracy to kill her baby. Thomas watched helplessly as his wife deteriorated before his eyes, unable to help her, unable to reach her through the walls of madness that enclosed her mind. The winter of 1901 was particularly brutal in Tennessee. Snow fell heavily, covering Crossville in a white blanket that made travel difficult and isolated families in their homes. The cold seeped through the walls of the Dilling house, and Thomas struggled to keep the stove burning with what little wood and coal he could afford. Margaret spent most of her time in bed, wrapped in every blanket they owned, her swollen belly the only warm part of her body. She talked constantly now, but rarely to Thomas. She spoke to her mother, to God, to the devil, to entities Thomas couldn't see or understand. Her voice was hoarse from endless talking, her eyes wild and unfocused. On a February night, when the snow was falling so heavily that the town seemed to disappear into whiteness, Margaret went into labor. Thomas tried to fetch the midwife, Mrs. Patterson, who lived 3 houses down, but the snow was too deep and the wind too fierce. He returned to find Margaret screaming, not in pain from the contractions, but in terror, claiming that demons were trying to steal the baby from her womb. Thomas had never felt so helpless. He had no idea how to deliver a baby, no understanding of what to do. He could only hold Margaret's hand as she screamed and writhed, praying to a God he wasn't sure was listening. The labor lasted 14 hours. Margaret's screams could be heard throughout the neighborhood despite the snow and wind. When the baby finally emerged, a boy Thomas would name Jacob after his father, Margaret immediately began screaming that it wasn't hers, that it was a changeling, a monster in infant form. She refused to hold the baby, refused to look at him, turning her face to the wall and sobbing. Thomas wrapped the newborn in a clean cloth, cutting the umbilical cord with a kitchen knife he had sterilized in boiling water, his hands shaking with fear and exhaustion. The baby was small and weak, his cries thin and desperate, but he was alive. Thomas managed to get Mrs. Patterson to the house the next morning. The elderly midwife checked on Margaret and the baby, her face grave with concern. She told Thomas that Margaret had lost a dangerous amount of blood, that she was severely malnourished, and that her mental state was worse than anything she had seen in her 40 years of delivering babies. She advised Thomas to find a way to get Margaret to Nashville, to the asylum, before she hurt herself or the baby. But Thomas couldn't accept that option. He convinced himself that with time and care, Margaret would improve, that motherhood would eventually awaken something maternal in her. But Margaret never bonded with her son. She refused to feed him, refused to touch him, claimed he wasn't human. Thomas had to find a wet nurse in town, paying precious money he didn't have to keep his son alive. He worked during the day and cared for both Margaret and the baby at night, getting maybe 2 or 3 hours of sleep. His body began to break down under the strain. He lost weight, his eyes became bloodshot, his hands trembled constantly. At work, he made mistakes that nearly caused accidents. His supervisor gave him a final warning: get his life in order or lose his job. The breaking point came in April of 1902. Thomas returned home from work to find Margaret standing over baby Jacob's cradle with a knife in her hand. She was talking to herself, arguing with voices only she could hear, debating whether she should kill the baby to save it from a fate worse than death. Thomas lunged forward, grabbing her wrist, wrestling the knife away from her. Margaret fought him with a strength born of madness, scratching his face, biting his arm, screaming that he was part of the conspiracy against her. Thomas managed to subdue her, holding her until she exhausted herself and collapsed in his arms, weeping. That night, with Margaret sedated with laudanum the doctor reluctantly provided, Thomas made the hardest decision of his life. He packed a small bag for Margaret, wrapped baby Jacob in blankets, and prepared for the journey to Nashville. He would take her to the asylum. He had no other choice. He couldn't risk coming home one day to find his son murdered by his own mother. The decision tore his heart apart, but he saw no alternative. The woman he had loved, the woman he had married hoping to save, was beyond his ability to help. She needed more than he could give, more than love and patience could provide. The journey to Nashville in the spring of 1902 was a nightmare Thomas Dilling would never forget. He hired a wagon from a local farmer, paying nearly a month's wages for the privilege. Margaret sat in the back, bound with rope to prevent her from jumping out or harming herself, her eyes vacant and unseeing, her lips moving in constant silent conversation. Baby Jacob, just 2 months old, cried incessantly, hungry and cold despite Thomas's best efforts to keep him warm and fed. The trip that should have taken 2 days stretched into 4 due to rain that turned the roads into rivers of mud, nearly causing the wagon to overturn several times. Nashville in 1902 was a growing city, modernizing rapidly with electric streetlights, telephone lines, and grand buildings that spoke of progress and prosperity. But on the outskirts of the city, far from the elegant downtown, stood the Tennessee Hospital for the Insane, a massive stone structure that looked more like a prison than a place of healing. The building was surrounded by high walls topped with iron spikes, and the windows were barred and small, letting in little light. The grounds were bare of vegetation except for a few dying trees, and the air around the place seemed heavy with despair. Thomas carried Margaret to the entrance while a nurse he had hired for the journey held baby Jacob. Margaret had stopped fighting by then, her body limp and unresponsive, as if she had left it behind and her mind had traveled elsewhere. The administrator who met them at the door was a thin, officious man named Mr. Carlyle, who looked at Margaret with the detached interest of someone examining a specimen rather than a human being. He asked Thomas a series of questions about Margaret's symptoms, her behavior, her family history, taking notes in a leather-bound book with mechanical efficiency. The admission process was cold and bureaucratic. Thomas signed papers transferring custody of his wife to the state, agreeing to pay a monthly fee for her care that would consume most of his income. He was told he could visit once a month but warned that many patients became more agitated after family visits, so it might be better to stay away. Mr. Carlyle explained that Margaret would be housed in the women's ward, that she would be given medication to calm her, and that the doctors would attempt various treatments to restore her sanity. He did not mention what those treatments were, and Thomas, in his exhaustion and grief, didn't ask. When they took Margaret away, she didn't protest. She walked between two large male orderlies as if in a trance, her bare feet making no sound on the cold stone floor. Thomas called out to her, told her he loved her, promised he would come back for her when she was better. Margaret didn't turn around. She simply disappeared through a heavy iron door that clanged shut behind her with a sound of absolute finality. Thomas stood there for a long moment, holding his infant son, feeling as if he had just committed an unforgivable sin. Then he turned and walked out into the spring sunshine, which seemed obscenely bright and cheerful given the darkness he felt inside. Returning to Crossville without Margaret felt surreal. The house seemed emptier than it had any right to be. Thomas hired Mrs. Patterson to care for Jacob during the day while he worked, paying her what little he had left after the asylum fees. He threw himself into his work with desperate intensity, trying to exhaust himself enough that he couldn't think about what he had done. But at night, alone in the bed he had shared with Margaret, he was tormented by memories and guilt. He wondered if he had given up on her too easily, if there had been another way. He wondered what was happening to her in that terrible place. The reality of what was happening to Margaret was worse than Thomas could have imagined. The Tennessee Hospital for the Insane in 1902 operated on theories of mental illness that were barbaric at best and sadistic at worst. The doctors believed that madness was caused by moral weakness, physical illness, or demonic possession, depending on their particular educational background. Treatments included forced ice baths that lasted for hours, designed to shock the patient back to sanity. They used restraints that left patients immobilized for days at a time, causing bedsores and muscle atrophy. They administered medications that were essentially poisons, including mercury compounds, arsenic solutions, and massive doses of opiates that left patients in a stupor. Margaret was subjected to all of these treatments. Her medical file, which would later be discovered in the asylum archives, documented a systematic assault on her body and mind disguised as therapy. She was beaten when she was uncooperative, locked in isolation cells no bigger than closets when she screamed, and force-fed when she refused to eat. The male orderlies, unsupervised and unchecked, took liberties with the female patients that would be considered criminal assault. Margaret, beautiful despite her madness and fragility, became a favorite target. The abuse she suffered in that place was never recorded in official documents, but it was witnessed by other patients who survived long enough to tell their stories decades later. Thomas visited Margaret once, in June of 1902. He made the long journey to Nashville with baby Jacob, hoping that seeing her son might spark something maternal in her, might help her find a reason to fight for her sanity. But the woman he was allowed to see for 15 minutes in a bare visitation room was not the Margaret he had known. She had lost even more weight, her body skeletal beneath the rough institutional gown. Her beautiful black hair had been cut short, apparently to prevent lice, giving her the appearance of a convict. Her green eyes, once so captivating, were dull and unfocused, courtesy of the heavy sedation she was kept under. When Thomas tried to show her Jacob, now 4 months old and beginning to smile, Margaret showed no recognition, no interest. She simply stared through them as if they didn't exist. Thomas left that visit destroyed. He couldn't bear to see what his wife had become, couldn't face the guilt of knowing he had put her in that place. He told himself he would visit again soon, but months passed, then a year, then 2, and he never returned. Life in Crossville demanded all his attention and energy. Jacob was a sickly child, prone to fevers and infections, requiring constant care. Thomas's job at the railroad became more demanding as the company expanded its routes. He barely had time to sleep, much less make the arduous journey to Nashville. He continued to pay the monthly asylum fees, believing that at least Margaret was safe and receiving the best care available, never knowing the horror of her daily existence. In October of 1904, Thomas received a telegram from the Tennessee Hospital for the Insane. Margaret Hayes Dilling had died. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia, but no further details were provided. Thomas was informed that her body would be buried in the asylum cemetery unless he wished to claim it and arrange alternative burial at his own expense. Thomas, broke and broken, couldn't afford to bring Margaret home. She was buried in an unmarked grave on the asylum grounds, one of hundreds of forgotten souls who died in that place. She was 22 years old. Thomas told young Jacob, not yet 3 years old, that his mother had died of an illness, which was technically true. He didn't tell him where she had been, what she had suffered, or the madness that had consumed her. He packed away Margaret's few belongings and tried to move forward with his life. But the guilt stayed with him, a constant weight on his soul. He began to drink, not heavily like Margaret's father had, but enough to dull the edge of his pain. He aged rapidly, his body wearing down from hard labor and emotional exhaustion. By the time he was 35, he looked 50. Jacob Dilling grew up knowing he had been the cause of his mother's death, even though no one explicitly told him so. Children in small towns hear whispers, pick up fragments of adult conversations, piece together truths from silences and evasions. He knew his mother had gone mad after he was born. He knew his father had sent her away. He knew she had died young. And somewhere deep in his developing psyche, these facts crystallized into a core belief that he was cursed, that his very existence brought destruction to those around him. Young Jacob was a strange, withdrawn child. He didn't play with other children, preferring to spend hours alone, staring at insects, dissecting dead animals he found in the woods, lost in dark thoughts no child should have. He was intelligent, learning to read and do mathematics far ahead of his peers, but he had no interest in using these abilities for anything constructive. He seemed to view the world with a cold, analytical detachment, as if he were studying specimens rather than interacting with people. Other children found him unsettling and avoided him. Their parents, remembering his mad mother, warned their children to stay away from the Dilling boy. Thomas tried to be a good father, but he was ill-equipped for the task. He worked long hours, leaving Jacob in the care of various neighbors and relatives who performed their duties with minimal effort and affection. He didn't know how to talk to his son about emotions or fears, having been raised in a generation where men didn't discuss such things. He taught Jacob practical skills, how to chop wood, how to fish, how to repair things around the house, but he never taught him how to connect with other human beings, how to love or trust or hope. As Jacob entered adolescence, disturbing behaviors began to emerge. He was caught torturing a cat, explaining with scientific curiosity that he wanted to see how long it would take to die. He got into fights at school, not because he was bullied, but because he seemed to enjoy causing pain. He stole, not out of need but apparently for the thrill of it. Thomas was called to the school multiple times, faced with his son's antisocial behavior, unsure what to do about it. The townspeople began to say that the madness had passed from Margaret to her son, that the Dilling bloodline was tainted. In 1914, when Jacob was 12 years old, Thomas Dilling died. He collapsed while working on the railroad, a massive heart attack that killed him almost instantly. He was only 41 years old, but his body had been worn out by years of physical labor, emotional stress, and the slow poison of grief. Jacob found himself orphaned, alone in a town that viewed him with suspicion and fear. He was placed in the care of his father's brother, Samuel Dilling, a farmer who lived 20 miles outside Crossville and who took Jacob in out of obligation rather than love. The years Jacob spent with his uncle's family were marked by isolation and resentment. Samuel had 4 children of his own, and he made it clear that Jacob was not truly part of the family, that he was there on sufferance and should be grateful for even that. Jacob was given the hardest chores, the smallest portions of food, the coldest corner of the barn to sleep in. He attended school sporadically when farm work permitted, and he left permanently at age 14 to work full-time on his uncle's farm. He grew into a tall, thin young man with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair, physically attractive but with something deeply wrong in his expression, something that made people uncomfortable when they looked at him too long. At 17, in 1919, Jacob left his uncle's farm without a word. He simply walked away one morning and never returned. He wandered through Tennessee, working odd jobs, sleeping in barns and under bridges, slowly making his way toward the larger cities. The First World War had just ended, and the country was in a period of social upheaval. Young men who had seen the horrors of trench warfare returned home changed, traumatized, unable to fit back into normal life. Jacob, who had never fit into normal life to begin with, found himself in a world that suddenly seemed to match his internal chaos. He eventually made his way to Memphis, a city growing rapidly with industry and commerce. Memphis in the early 1920s was a place of opportunity and danger, where fortunes could be made and lost overnight, where violence lurked in back alleys and speakeasies, where the rules of polite society seemed suspended. Jacob found work at a meat packing plant, a brutal job that involved long hours in refrigerated rooms, processing animal carcasses with industrial efficiency. The work suited him. There was something satisfying about the systematic butchery, the reduction of living things into component parts. It was in Memphis that Jacob met Ruth Carson, the woman who would become his wife and the mother of his children. Ruth was a 20-year-old waitress at a diner near the packing plant, a pretty girl with auburn hair and brown eyes who had come to Memphis from a small town in Mississippi, hoping to make a better life. She was lonely and naive, and she mistook Jacob's intensity for passion, his coldness for strength. When Jacob showed interest in her, she responded with a desperate eagerness, starved for attention and affection. They married in 1922, a quick ceremony in a justice of the peace office, witnessed by two strangers pulled in from the street. Ruth was pregnant within a month, carrying the child who would be named Thomas after Jacob's father. She didn't know about Jacob's family history, about his mother's madness or his father's early death. Jacob never spoke of his past, and Ruth, caught up in the romance of their whirlwind courtship, never thought to ask. She believed she had found a good man who would provide for her and protect her. She had no idea what she had actually gotten herself into. The early years of Jacob and Ruth's marriage in Memphis appeared almost normal on the surface, but beneath that facade, darkness was growing. Jacob worked at the meat packing plant with methodical dedication, bringing home a steady if modest paycheck. Ruth kept their small apartment clean and cared for baby Thomas, who arrived in January of 1923. To their neighbors in the working-class tenement building, they seemed like any other young family struggling to make ends meet in the difficult economic climate following the First World War. But Ruth was beginning to see aspects of her husband that terrified her. Jacob showed no affection for his son. He held the baby only when absolutely necessary, and even then with visible discomfort, holding Thomas at arm's length as if the child might contaminate him. He never cooed at the baby, never smiled at him, never showed any of the pride that new fathers typically displayed. When Thomas cried, which was often, Jacob would fly into silent rages, his face darkening, his hands clenching into fists. Ruth learned to quickly soothe the baby whenever Jacob was home, terrified of what might happen if she failed. That Jacob's behavior toward Ruth also began to deteriorate. He was not physically violent in the traditional sense. He didn't beat her or throw things. Instead, his cruelty was more subtle and perhaps more damaging. He would go days without speaking to her, responding to her attempts at conversation with silence or monosyllabic grunts. He criticized everything she did, from her cooking to her housekeeping to the way she cared for Thomas, always finding fault, never offering praise. He controlled every penny of their money, giving Ruth barely enough for food and necessities, forcing her to account for every cent spent. He withheld physical affection, sleeping with his back to her, recoiling when she tried to touch him. Ruth, isolated in a city where she had no family or friends, began to break down under the psychological pressure. She developed nervous habits, constantly checking and rechecking locks, cleaning the same surfaces over and over, startling at sudden noises. She lost weight, her appetite disappearing along with her hope. She cried frequently, often without knowing why, the tears just flowing as if her body were trying to purge the sadness that filled her. She became convinced that she was a failure as a wife and mother, that everything wrong in her life was her fault, that she deserved Jacob's coldness because she was fundamentally inadequate. In 1925, Ruth gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Margaret, after Jacob's mother, though Ruth didn't know the significance of that name. The pregnancy had been difficult, marked by severe nausea and fatigue, and the birth itself was traumatic, nearly killing Ruth from blood loss. The doctor warned them not to have more children, saying that Ruth's body couldn't withstand another pregnancy. Jacob received this information with indifference, but Ruth felt a strange mixture of relief and grief, relieved she wouldn't have to go through that ordeal again, but grieving the loss of the large family she had once dreamed of having. Margaret was a sickly infant, plagued by colic and digestive problems that caused her to cry for hours every day. Ruth, exhausted and depleted from the difficult birth, struggled to care for both children. Thomas, now 2 years old, was a difficult toddler, prone to tantrums and aggressive behavior toward his mother. He had learned from his father that Ruth was weak, someone to be dominated rather than respected. He would hit her, bite her, scream at her, and Ruth, broken and hopeless, couldn't discipline him effectively. Jacob watched these dynamics with cold interest, never intervening, seemingly conducting some kind of experiment to see how far things would deteriorate. The family moved from Memphis to Knoxville in 1927 when the meat packing plant closed due to economic difficulties. Jacob found work in a textile mill, another brutal job in harsh conditions, but one that paid slightly better than his previous employment. They rented a small house on the outskirts of Knoxville, a drafty wooden structure surrounded by industrial buildings and railroad tracks. The neighborhood was rough, populated by immigrant workers and impoverished families, where violence and crime were commonplace. Thomas started school in 1929, entering first grade at age 6. He was immediately flagged as a problem child. He fought with other children, destroyed school property, and showed no interest in learning. He lied constantly, even about things that didn't matter, seemingly for the pleasure of deceiving. Teachers reported that he was intelligent enough to do the work but chose not to, preferring to disrupt the class and make learning impossible for everyone. Ruth was called to the school repeatedly, each meeting more humiliating than the last, as teachers and administrators made it clear they believed Thomas's behavior was her fault, the result of poor parenting. Margaret grew into a strange, withdrawn child who seemed to exist in her own world. She rarely spoke, even when directly addressed, communicating instead through gestures and expressions. She had an intense attachment to Ruth, following her mother everywhere, becoming hysterical when separated from her. She developed rituals and compulsions, insisting that everything in her environment be arranged in specific ways, melting down if her father moved something in the house. Doctors Ruth consulted told her that Margaret was simply nervous and would grow out of it, but Ruth could see something deeper and more troubling in her daughter's behavior. The stock market crash of October 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression devastated the already struggling Dilling family. The textile mill cut Jacob's hours and wages. Work became sporadic, with the mill shutting down for weeks at a time. The family survived on what little Ruth could earn taking in laundry and sewing, supplemented by occasional relief packages from church charities. They ate beans and cornbread for days on end, rarely seeing meat or fresh vegetables. The children's clothes became threadbare and patched. The house grew colder as they couldn't afford sufficient coal for heating. The stress of poverty exacerbated all of Jacob's worst qualities. He became even more controlling and cruel, blaming Ruth for their poverty as if she had somehow caused the economic collapse. He began drinking, spending money they desperately needed on bootleg whiskey, coming home late at night drunk and angry. He never hit Ruth or the children, but his presence became increasingly menacing. He would stand in doorways blocking exits, loom over Ruth while she worked, stare at the children with an expression that made them afraid to move or speak. The house filled with tension so thick it was almost physical. Thomas, now 10 years old, began displaying behavior that went beyond normal childhood misbehavior. He started fires, small ones at first, burning trash and leaves, then graduating to more dangerous blazes that threatened property. He killed neighborhood cats and dogs, leaving their mutilated bodies where they would be found, never admitting his crimes but clearly responsible. He stole from neighbors, from shopkeepers, from his own family. He showed no remorse when caught, no fear of punishment. He seemed to view consequences as challenges to be avoided rather than deterrents to bad behavior. Margaret, now 8, retreated further into herself. She stopped speaking entirely, communicating only through writing when absolutely necessary. She spent hours arranging and rearranging her few possessions, creating complex patterns that only she understood. She refused to eat in front of others, taking her meals alone in her room. She developed tics and repetitive movements, rocking back and forth, wringing her hands, picking at her skin until she bled. Ruth took her to multiple doctors, but no one could help, and Ruth couldn't afford the kind of extensive treatment Margaret clearly needed. In 1933, when Thomas was 11 and Margaret was 8, Ruth discovered she was pregnant again despite the doctor's warnings years earlier. The news sent her into a panic. She couldn't afford another child, physically or emotionally. She couldn't bear the thought of bringing another child into their horrible situation. She tried home remedies to induce a miscarriage, drinking bitter teas and taking hot baths, but the pregnancy continued. Jacob, when informed, showed no reaction at all, as if the information had no relevance to him whatsoever. The pregnancy was even harder than the previous two. Ruth was now 31 years old, malnourished and worn down by years of stress and poverty. She developed preeclampsia, causing dangerous swelling and high blood pressure. She was bedridden for the last 2 months, unable to care for Thomas and Margaret, leaving them to fend for themselves while Jacob worked or drank. The house descended into chaos, with unwashed dishes piling up, laundry going undone, the children eating whatever they could scrounge. The baby, another boy they named Jacob Jr., was born prematurely in November of 1933. He weighed barely 4 pounds, his tiny body struggling to survive. The doctor told Ruth bluntly that the baby would probably die within days, that she shouldn't get attached. But Jacob Jr. proved surprisingly resilient, clinging to life with a tenacity that seemed almost supernatural. Ruth, despite her exhaustion and depression, found herself bonding with this fragile infant in a way she hadn't with her older children. Perhaps it was because he needed her so completely, or perhaps it was because caring for him gave her a purpose when everything else in her life felt meaningless. Thomas reacted to his baby brother with immediate hostility. He would pinch the baby when Ruth wasn't looking, covering the infant's face with pillows, once even dropping him deliberately. Ruth became terrified to leave Thomas alone with the baby for even a moment. She carried Jacob Jr. everywhere, sleeping with him in her arms, creating a barrier between him and his siblings. This only increased Thomas's resentment and Margaret's distress at being excluded from her mother's attention. The family stumbled through the mid-1930s in a state of barely contained disaster. Jacob Sr. lost his job at the textile mill permanently when it closed in 1935. He found sporadic work as a day laborer, but it wasn't enough to support a family of 5. They were evicted from their house and moved to an even worse dwelling, essentially a shack on the edge of town with no running water or electricity. They used an outhouse, drew water from a communal pump, and lit their home with kerosene lamps and candles. Thomas left school permanently at age 13, legally allowed to do so under Tennessee law at the time. He took whatever jobs he could find, delivering newspapers, working on loading docks, running errands for local businesses. He gave his mother only a fraction of what he earned, keeping the rest for himself, and there was nothing Ruth could do about it. She needed whatever money he did contribute. Margaret attended school sporadically, when she could be coaxed out of the house, but she learned little, too consumed by her internal turmoil to focus on academics. In 1938, when Thomas was 15 years old, he committed his first serious crime. He broke into a neighbor's house and stole money and valuables, but he also vandalized the home, defecating on the floor, breaking furniture, apparently taking pleasure in the destruction itself. He was caught, arrested, and sent to a juvenile detention facility for 6 months. When he returned, he was harder, meaner, having learned new criminal skills from older boys in detention. He looked at his family with open contempt, particularly his father, whom he now saw as weak and pathetic. Jacob Sr., now 46 years old but looking 20 years older, seemed to have given up on life entirely. He drank constantly when he could afford alcohol, sat in silence when he couldn't, staring at nothing with empty eyes. He had become a ghost in his own home, barely interacting with his wife or children, just existing from one day to the next. Ruth sometimes wondered if he regretted his life, if he thought about his parents, if he understood that he had recreated and even amplified the dysfunction of his childhood. But she never asked, and he never volunteered such thoughts. As the 1930s drew to a close and war loomed in Europe, the Dilling family existed in a state of barely functional misery. Ruth had aged dramatically, her hair now almost entirely gray though she was only 37. Margaret, now 16, had never fully recovered from her troubled childhood and showed signs of mental instability similar to what her grandmother Margaret Hayes had experienced. Jacob Jr., approaching his 6th birthday, showed disturbing personality traits that reminded Ruth of both his father and older brother. And Thomas, now 17, was clearly on a path toward either prison or an early death. The 1940s brought new horrors to the Dilling family, proving that each generation would somehow find ways to surpass the dysfunction of the previous one. The Second World War, which dominated American life from 1941 onward, touched the family in ways both direct and indirect. Thomas, now 19 years old, was drafted into the army in 1942. For Ruth, this brought a mixture of relief and terror. Relief that his violent presence would be removed from their home, terror that he might die in combat, which would burden her with guilt despite everything he had put her through. Thomas survived the war, serving in the European theater as an infantryman. He saw combat in France and Germany, experienced horrors that would have traumatized most men, but seemed to emerge from the experience even more damaged and dangerous. The army actually suited him in some ways. The violence, the hierarchy, the lack of emotional connection required in combat, all aligned with his existing personality. He received medals for bravery, but those who served with him later spoke of a man who seemed to enjoy killing, who took unnecessary risks not out of courage but out of a disturbing lack of regard for his own life or the lives of others. While Thomas was overseas, Ruth struggled to hold the family together in Knoxville. Jacob Sr. died in 1943, at age 51. The death certificate listed heart failure, but Ruth knew it was more accurate to say he had simply given up on living. She felt almost nothing at his death, which troubled her. She thought she should feel grief or relief or something, but there was only numbness. They buried him in a pauper's grave with the briefest of ceremonies. Thomas did not come home for the funeral, and Ruth didn't try very hard to get him leave. Margaret, now 21, had deteriorated significantly. She had never married, never held a job, barely left the house. She spent her days engaged in increasingly bizarre rituals, washing her hands until they bled, counting and recounting objects, speaking in a monotone voice to entities no one else could see. Ruth finally managed to get her evaluated by a psychiatrist at a public health clinic, who diagnosed her with what he called dementia praecox, what would later be known as schizophrenia. He recommended institutionalization, but Ruth, remembering what she had learned about Jacob's mother's fate in an asylum, refused. She kept Margaret at home, caring for her as best she could, watching her daughter disappear into madness inch by inch. Jacob Jr., now 10 years old, was already showing signs that the family curse had not skipped him. He was a cruel child, taking pleasure in the suffering of others, unable to form genuine emotional connections, lying and manipulating with disturbing skill. He tortured animals, bullied smaller children, stole compulsively. Ruth could see her husband in him, could see Thomas in him, could see all the worst traits of the Dilling line concentrated in this one child. She was exhausted and defeated, too worn down to parent effectively, barely able to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. Thomas returned from the war in 1946, 24 years old and even more psychologically damaged than when he had left. He was one of millions of veterans struggling to readjust to civilian life, but his struggles were complicated by personality disorders that predated his military service. He drifted from job to job, unable to hold employment for more than a few weeks. He drank heavily, got into fights, had run-ins with the police. He moved back in with Ruth and his siblings, contributing nothing to the household but taking up space and resources. In 1947, Thomas met a woman named Dorothy Walsh at a bar in downtown Knoxville. Dorothy was a 19-year-old factory worker, pretty in a faded sort of way, with a history of bad relationships and poor judgment. She was attracted to Thomas's intensity and his war veteran status, mistaking his coldness for the strong, silent type. They married after knowing each other for only 2 months, a hasty ceremony that Ruth attended with a heart full of dread, knowing how this story would end. Thomas and Dorothy moved into a small apartment and produced their first child, a son named Robert, in 1948. Then came Patricia in 1950, and finally Michael in 1952. Thomas proved to be an even worse husband and father than his own father had been. He was physically violent toward Dorothy, beating her regularly, breaking her bones, sending her to the hospital with injuries she had to lie about. He terrorized his children, using brutal corporal punishment for the slightest infractions, creating an atmosphere of constant fear in their home. Dorothy tried to leave him multiple times, but this was an era when women had few options for escape from abusive marriages. She had no education, no skills that paid well enough to support 3 children alone, no family willing to help. Divorce carried enormous social stigma, and police rarely intervened in domestic disputes, considering them private family matters. She was trapped, and she and her children paid the price for her mistake in marrying Thomas Dilling. Back in Ruth's household, Margaret's condition continued to worsen. By 1950, at age 28, she was completely non-functional. She couldn't dress herself, feed herself, or handle any of the basic tasks of daily living. She spent most of her time sitting in a chair by the window, rocking back and forth, occasionally speaking in a garbled word salad that made no sense to anyone listening. Ruth, now 48 years old and in failing health herself, could no longer care for her. She finally agreed to have Margaret committed to the state mental hospital in Nashville, the same institution where her grandmother had died decades earlier. Margaret's admission to the hospital in 1951 began another chapter in the family's tragic story. The psychiatric treatment available had improved somewhat since 1902, but it was still primitive and often harmful. Margaret was subjected to electroconvulsive therapy, insulin shock therapy, and heavy medication with antipsychotic drugs that left her in a zombified state. She was institutionalized for the rest of her life, dying in 1968 at age 46, having spent 17 years in that place, forgotten by everyone except Ruth, who visited as often as her limited means allowed. Jacob Jr., the youngest of Ruth's children, followed a predictable path into criminality. By age 16, in 1959, he had been arrested multiple times for theft, assault, and vandalism. At 18, he was convicted of armed robbery and sentenced to 10 years in state prison. He served 7 years, was released in 1966, and within a year was back in prison for burglary. He would spend most of his adult life incarcerated, a career criminal who showed no capacity for rehabilitation, no remorse for his crimes, no connection to anything or anyone outside his own immediate wants and needs. Ruth died in 1961, at the age of 59. The death certificate listed heart disease, but really she died of exhaustion, of decades of poverty and stress and grief, of watching everyone she had ever tried to love either die or destroy themselves. She was buried next to Jacob Sr. in the paupers section of the cemetery, her funeral attended by only a handful of people who barely knew her. Her children, if they mourned her at all, did so privately and briefly, unable to feel the kind of deep grief that requires genuine love. That Thomas's family became the 3rd generation to fully embody the Dilling family curse. Robert, the oldest son, developed alcoholism in his teens and never recovered. He bounced from one minimum wage job to another, living in a series of cheap apartments and boarding houses, dying at age 43 from cirrhosis of the liver in 1991. Patricia, the daughter, married young to escape her father's house but chose an abusive husband who was just like Thomas. She had 4 children she could barely care for, repeating the cycle of dysfunction yet again. Michael, the youngest, was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder in his 20s after a series of violent crimes. He was imprisoned for assault with intent to kill and served 15 years. Dorothy, Thomas's wife, finally found freedom when Thomas died in 1976. He was only 54, but decades of drinking and smoking had destroyed his body. He died of lung cancer, a slow and painful death that Dorothy watched with a mixture of sorrow and relief. She told people she mourned him, but in truth, she mourned the life she might have had if she had never met him, the person she might have been if he hadn't destroyed her. The pattern continued into the fourth generation. Robert's children from his brief marriages became addicts and criminals. Patricia's 4 children all struggled with mental health issues, poverty, and dysfunctional relationships. Michael's daughter, born while he was in prison and raised by her unstable mother, developed borderline personality disorder and attempted suicide multiple times. The Dilling name, once simply unremarkable, had become synonymous with dysfunction, tragedy, and inherited darkness. Social workers and mental health professionals who encountered various members of the Dilling family over the decades noted the patterns but had no effective interventions. This was before the era of comprehensive understanding about generational trauma, about how abuse and neglect literally change brain development, about how poverty and stress create biological changes that can be passed to offspring. The family was viewed as simply bad people making bad choices, rather than as victims of a tragic cascade of mental illness, trauma, and social failure that had begun a century earlier. In the 1990s and 2000s, descendants of the Dilling family were scattered across Tennessee and neighboring states. Most had no idea they were related, the family tree having fractured into disconnected branches. Those who did know their family history often changed their names or moved away, trying to escape the legacy. But escape was not simple. The trauma coded into their DNA, the patterns learned in childhood, the mental health issues inherited through genetics or environment or both, these things followed them wherever they went. The story of the Dilling family became a case study used by researchers studying generational trauma and inherited mental illness. Academic papers examined how untreated mental illness in one generation could cascade through subsequent generations, how poverty and lack of access to healthcare compounded problems, how social stigma prevented people from seeking help. The family became an example of how a single tragic marriage in 1901 could echo through more than a century, destroying life after life. By the early 21st century, the direct line of descent from Thomas and Margaret Dilling had largely died out or dispersed. The family cemetery in Crossville held forgotten graves of Dillings who had died in the early 1900s. The small house where Thomas and Margaret had briefly lived was long gone, replaced by a gas station. The Tennessee asylum where both Margaret Hayes Dilling and her granddaughter Margaret Dilling had suffered was closed and partially demolished, its records scattered or destroyed. Most of the physical evidence of the family's existence had disappeared, but the legacy remained in the lives of those descendants who still struggled with depression, anxiety, personality disorders, addiction, and all the other manifestations of inherited trauma. It remained in social services files documenting abuse and neglect. It remained in prison records showing generation after generation of Dilling descendants incarcerated. It remained in medical records documenting mental illness treated with varying degrees of success. The question researchers asked was whether the curse could have been broken at any point. If Thomas Dilling had not married Margaret Hayes, would his life have been different? If Margaret Hayes had received proper treatment for her mental illness instead of being warehoused in an asylum, could she have recovered? If Jacob Dilling had been raised in a stable, loving home, would he have still developed antisocial traits? If Ruth had left Jacob before having children, could that branch of the family tree have been saved? If Thomas the Younger had received treatment for his psychological issues after the war, could his children have had better lives? The answer seemed to be yes and no. Mental illness has genetic components that no amount of environmental improvement can completely eliminate. But environment matters enormously. Trauma compounds across generations. Poverty limits options and increases stress. Lack of access to healthcare allows treatable conditions to become chronic and disabling. The Dilling family curse was not supernatural, but it was real, a combination of genetics, trauma, poverty, and social failure that created a perfect storm of dysfunction spanning generations. In 2015, a local historian in Crossville, Tennessee, became interested in the Dilling family story and began researching their history. She found fragments of information in census records, death certificates, asylum records, and newspaper archives. She interviewed elderly townspeople who remembered hearing stories about the Dillings from their parents and grandparents. She pieced together a narrative of tragedy spanning more than a century, from the marriage of Thomas and Margaret in 1901 to the scattered descendants living in the early 21st century. Her research revealed a truth both simple and heartbreaking. The Dillings were not uniquely cursed or fundamentally evil. They were a family caught in a cycle of mental illness and trauma that began with one sick young woman in an era when treatment didn't exist, compounded by a series of tragic choices and circumstances, amplified by poverty and lack of resources, and perpetuated through generations who never had a chance to break free. They were, in the end, a cautionary tale about what happens when mental illness goes untreated, when trauma is ignored, when society fails its most vulnerable members. The historian published her findings in a local history journal, a dry academic article that few people read. But for those who did, the story of the Dilling family served as a reminder of the invisible legacies we all carry, the weight of history that shapes us in ways we don't always recognize, and the importance of breaking cycles of dysfunction before they span generations. The cursed marriage of Thomas and Margaret Dilling in 1901 had indeed spawned 3 generations of madness. But the curse was not supernatural. It was simply the brutal reality of untreated mental illness and compounded trauma in a society that lacked the knowledge, resources, and compassion to help those who desperately needed it. To uncover more stories that reveal the hidden secrets and forgotten mysteries of the past, leave a like if this deep investigation kept you hooked until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Did you know that 80% of people who watch aren't subscribed and end up missing incredible stories? It costs nothing. Oh, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and share other dark tales that, in your opinion, deserve to be explored here on the channel. See you soon.